So out of this, you've got the British and Americans funding, training, arming mujahideen, freedom fighters that have an Arab nationalist bent that comes from World War II. This has been going on a long time. What's been cooking that comes up to 9/11. 80 years. It was stewing on the stove, being funded by taxpayer dollars, being hidden by national security, being done without oversight, and being used conveniently to scare people in these countries to giving up their rights. Now he brings in Osama bin Laden. He claims that neither Pakistan nor the United States realized that Osama bin Laden, quote, might later do with the organization that they had assembled for him, enabled him to establish, right? So they give this guy this network, arms, they get him all pissed off, and then they're like surprised that he would come back and orchestrate 9/11. Again, according to the official story, even if you go with the official story, the guy who's the mastermind of it is an agent of MI6 and works closely with CIA. The CIA provided a variety of arms to the ISI. That's the Pakistani intelligence arm that was created by the British that actually paid Mohammed Atta $100,000. So this is going back to the evidence. When you follow the evidence, it goes back not to a conspiracy theory, but to facts about US and UK foreign policy. The CIA provided a variety of arms to the ISI, including plastic explosives, sniper rifles, and sophisticated electronic timing and detonation devices that made it easier to set off explosions from a remote location. Dual-use items that could be used both for attacking military targets and also in terrorist operations. You'd think they wouldn't want to do that, but when you understand that they profit from it, it makes a lot of sense. Welcome back to Smart Reads. Today we're going to look at a book called Secret Affairs. Let me click over so you can see it. Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. It's a book by Mark Curtis. It's going to be very exciting as we break into, it's obviously, let's show you how thick it is. It's a good thickness of a book. It's all very interesting. And let's talk about it for a second. Secret Affairs. I read this book probably 5 or 6 years ago. It was printed in 2010. I'll get to, there's no cover flap to read from, but we'll read from the introduction and little samples from a couple of chapters. It's written by Mark Curtis, who is alive and well. He's a writer in Britain. You can find him on Twitter. I follow him on Twitter if you're having trouble finding which Mark Curtis he is. And I found the book to be fascinating because it presents a British view of a lot of events that we consider in America to be wholly American. A lot of things going on with the global war on terrorism that America took on after 9/11 were pre-planned, put in motion over a series of decades leading up to 9/11. And I think it's very important to consider the present influence of other allies to America in these events, because by learning how they view the history, we can also learn about our own history. I've referred to 9/11 as an event through which, if you look into it, if you look into and research it, it's a keyhole into a much wider and deeper and broader and more detailed perspective on history than is on the public side of that keyhole. So the public is told there's 18 hijackers, they take over these planes, they create these events funded by Osama bin Laden, so therefore we have to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. War in Afghanistan is still going on, by the way. So this is 2019. It's been 18 years. That's the longest war in American history. And the British have had a long history of war in Afghanistan before 9/11. There was the first Anglo-Afghan war in the 1800s. There was a second Anglo-Afghan war. There was a third, I believe, Anglo-Afghan war, which is the English, the British, fighting in Afghanistan. Then there was also participation during Operation Cyclone in 1979. That's joint operations between the UK and the United States to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan using a freedom fighter called Osama bin Laden. Specifically, it was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a protege of David Rockefeller and co-created the Trilateral Commission in 1973. Brzezinski, as national security advisor, cut a deal with the Mujahideen, which we'll learn about some of their history tonight in this book. The Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, pushed Soviets out of Afghanistan. That led toward the end of the Cold War, which was one of the purposes of getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan, using Afghanistan to break them, using Afghanistan as an anvil, a political anvil, as you'll see, is not a new idea that Brzezinski came up with. And subsequent to Operation Cyclone 1979, 1980, these sort of activities, covert activities by the United States and Britain, there was still continued funding, arming, training, housing, organization of these Islamic proxy forces, which had been, as you'll learn, it's a long tradition of the British Empire to train such proxy forces to maintain its empire and to subjugate, to overthrow, to undermine otherwise sovereign areas of the world. All right, so that's the spectrum of information surrounding this book. There's a long history. This book covers many specifics of various instances, funding of Gaddafi, funding of Saddam Hussein, funding of these propped up dictator enemies that later US, UK forces go in and subjugate and obliterate with smarter and smarter weapons. Also in the mix, not mentioned in this book, but Mark Curtis will be very familiar with it. He comments on it from time to time, is the grandiose nature of the United States and United Kingdom, their arms trade, their private arms trade, to kingdoms like Saudi Arabia, to other countries that are also involved in these ongoing skirmishes. And if we're going to seek to have peace in the future where freedom still exists, then we have to understand the history that has brought us up to this point. Studying 9/11 from the events of 9/11 leaves out this rich context of history that came before 9/11 of the United States working with various allies and covert operations that directly sponsored at any level of the official story many of the facets that put that story into motion, allowed it to happen, and helped in its cover-up. So there are still secrets to be observed of these events because there's a lot of national security around these events and you're not told the truth by de facto. It's like the national security itself means you, the public, are getting something other than the truth. So to figure out what that truth is without having access to that national security data, a lot of which the declassified documents is what Curtis used for this book. But without that, you have to understand the key players, the key mechanisms, the key tools, tactics, strategies, the key events in history relevant to the things as they come up in present day events. So once upon a time, 9/11 was a present day event. I unfortunately did not know a lot of the history that I needed to know to understand those events readily. It took a long time reading many books, many of them behind me, to figure out what are the dynamics that are really driving world affairs, foreign policy, these sort of things, and how does that differ from what we, the public, are being told through mainstream media. So without further ado, let's cut over to the book. Here we go. Let me get that squared up. Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. Mark Curtis. Where's my spectacles for this? Sensational in the best sense, Secret Affairs reveals the truth behind today's news. John Pilger, a very respected independent journalist who's documented these crimes over the years by the cartel you might call the globalists. Mark Curtis is an author, journalist, and consultant. His previous books include the best-selling Web of Deceit, Britain's Real Role in the World, and Unpeople, Britain's Secret Human Rights Abuses. He was formerly a research fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, director of the World Development Movement, and head of policy at ActionAid and ChristianAid. His websites are markcurtis.info and curtisresearch.org. Published 2010. And let's look at the contents. Over here you've got a map. This would be of the Middle East and India, the subcontinent. And in the contents, in case you should want to read this book, which I would recommend after you understand the nature and gravamen of these samples that I'm going to purvey this evening. There's Imperial Divide and Rule. That's the first chapter. Partition in India and Palestine. Oh, there was more than partition in Palestine going on back then. And also, I'd point out, also in 1947, which ties back into the Loftus, the smart reads we did for the witness tree. 1947 was also the year that Britain created Pakistan as the Muslim sub-state off of India. So there was a lot of nation building and reorganization of the world on the other side of the world during the time where most Americans are just, living a post-war rise in the economy. The interesting parts, the Saudi and Iranian revolutions, that's page 112, training in terrorism, the Afghan jihad, the dictator, the king, and the Ayatollah, nurturing Al-Qaeda, that's of particular interest, killing Gaddafi, overthrowing Saddam, and 9/11 connections. Interesting. Let's go from the introduction. Square it up here. The British intelligence agencies say they have prevented 12 terrorist plots in Britain over the past decade and claim that there are 2,000 known terrorist suspects organized in 200 networks. He has a footnote. He has a footnote for everything. The references for this book are extensive and pretty impeccable. So take it for what it's worth to you, given that. Counterterrorism officials warn of a huge, spectacular, and shooting and hostage-taking raids involving gunmen with bombs. Also a footnote. The extent of the terrorist threat is all too easily exaggerated for political purposes. The former director of MI5, Stella Remington, has, for example, accused the government of, quote, frightening the people in order to be able to pass laws which restrict civil liberties, end quote. But Britain, along with many other Western countries, clearly does face a threat from radical Islamic groups. In July 2005, in the July 2005 London bombings, which killed 52 people and injured over 700, constituted the single worst terrorist atrocity on British soil and the first, quote, successful attack by Islamists in Britain. The British courts have convicted over 80 individuals who planned to kill British citizens in acts of terrorism. Meanwhile, Britain's most senior military figure calls the threat posed by Islamic extremism, quote, the struggle of our generation, perhaps our 30 years' war, end quote. How we got to this point has been a subject of much speculation in the media. Various answers have been given as to how, quote, homegrown British citizens can turn to terrorist violence and be prepared to blow themselves up. Right-wing commentators typically blame the British liberal culture, arguing that the laws have not been tough enough to clamp down on the extremism, or even that multiculturalism has made it impossible to challenge people of a different faith. The government has been widely attacked since 7/7 for failing for years to clamp down on a number of Islamist radicals in Britain, most notoriously Abu Hamza, the former preacher at the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, who was allowed to openly espouse violent jihad to numerous young Muslims. Skipping down. But there is a big missing link in this commentary, and Britain's contribution to the rise of the terrorist threat goes well beyond its current disastrous interventions in the Middle East. With some of these radical Islamic forces, Britain has been in a permanent strategic alliance to secure fundamental long-term foreign policy goals. With others, it has been a temporary marriage of convenience to achieve specific short-term outcomes. The U.S. has been shown by some analysts to have nurtured Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. But Britain's part in fostering Islamist terrorism is invariably left out of these accounts, and the history has never been told. Yet, this collusion has had more impact on the rise of the terrorist threat than either Britain's liberal culture or the inspiration for jihadism provided by the occupation of Iraq. A good case can be argued that Al-Qaeda is partly a creature of Britain's Saudi ally, given the direct links between Saudi intelligence and bin Laden from the early years of the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Curtis continues down. He mentions the Muslim Brotherhood and the Pakistan, how it was hived off from India in 1947 with the help of British planners. But I don't want to read you his whole introduction. I'm just trying to take these pieces and give you a distillation. He says, although my argument is that Britain has historically contributed to the development of global terrorism, the current threat to Britain is not simply blowback, since Whitehall's collusion with radical Islam is continuing, albeit in a different form. Planners not only continue their special relationships with Riyadh and Islamabad, but they are also conniving with groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Shia Islamists in Iraq, and in effect with elements of the Taliban in Afghanistan, in a desperate effort to counter the numerous current challenges to the British position in the Middle East. The roots of the British collaboration with radical Islam, as we will see in the first chapter, go back to the divide and rule policies promoted during the Empire, when British officials regularly sought to cultivate Muslim groups or individuals to counter emerging nationalist forces challenging British hegemony. It is well known that British planners helped to create the modern Middle East during and after the First World War by placing rulers in territories drawn up by British planners. But British policy is also involved in restoring the caliphate, the leadership of the Muslim world, back to Saudi Arabia, where it could come under British control, a strategy which had tremendous significance for the future Saudi kingdom and the rest of the world. After the Second World War, British planners were confronted with the imminent loss of empire and the rise of two new superpowers, but were determined to maintain as much political and commercial influence in the world as possible. Although Southeast Asia and Africa were important to British planners, largely due to their raw material resources, it was the Middle East, due to its colossal oil reserves, over which London mainly wanted to exert influence. Yet, a major enemy arose in the form of popular Arab nationalism led by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, which sought to promote an independent foreign policy and end Middle Eastern states' reliance on the West. To contain the threat, Britain and the United States not only propped up conservative, pro-Western monarchs and feudal leaders, but also fomented covert relationships with Islamist forces, notably the Muslim Brotherhood, to destabilize and overthrow the nationalist governments. That refers also directly back to John Loftus's comments from the last Smart Reads. As Britain withdrew its military forces from the Middle East in the late 1960s, Islamist forces such as the Saudi regime and, once again, the Muslim Brotherhood, were often seen as proxies to maintain British interests in the region, to continue to destabilize communist or nationalist regimes, or as muscle to bolster pro-British right-wing governments. By the 1970s, Arab nationalism had been virtually defeated as a political force, partly thanks to Anglo-American opposition. It was largely replaced by the rising force of radical Islam, which London again often saw as a handy weapon to counter the remnants of secular nationalism and communism in key states such as Egypt and Jordan. After the Afghanistan war in the 1980s spawned a variety of terrorist forces, including Al-Qaeda, terrorist atrocities began to be mounted for the first time in Muslim countries and then, in the 1990s, in Europe and the United States. Yet, crucially for this story, Britain continued to see some of these groups as useful, principally as proxy guerrilla forces in places as diverse as Bosnia, Azerbaijan, Kosovo, and Libya. There, they were used either to help break up the Soviet Union and secure major oil interests, or to fight nationalist regimes. This time those of Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Prop up the regimes and tear them down. Although Britain has forged long-standing special relationships with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, it has not been in strategic alliance with radical Islam as such. Crucially, British collusion with radical Islam has also helped promote two big geostrategic foreign policy objectives. The first is the influence and control over key energy resources, always recognized in the British planning documents as the number one priority in the Middle East. For example, British operations to support or side with Islamist forces have generally aimed at maintaining power in or installing governments that will promote Western-friendly oil policies. The second objective has been maintaining Britain's place within a pro-Western global financial order. The Saudis have invested billions of dollars in the United States and British economies and banking systems, and Britain and the U.S. have similarly large investments and trade with Saudi Arabia. It is these that are being protected by the strategic alliance with Riyadh. Since the period of 1973-75, when the British officials secretly made a range of deals with the Saudis to invest their oil revenues in Britain, as we shall see, there has been a tacit Anglo-American Saudi pact to maintain this financial order, entailing London and Washington turning a blind eye to whatever else the Saudis spend their money on. This has been accompanied on the Saudi side by a strategy of bankrolling Islamist and jihadist causes and a Muslim foreign policy aimed at maintaining the Saud family in power. Curtis continues, my argument is not that radical Islam and violent jihadism are British or Western creations, since this would overstate the Western influence in regions like the Middle East and Southeast Asia, where numerous domestic and international factors have shaped these forces over a long period. But British policy has contributed to the present threat of terrorism, although this dare not be mentioned in mainstream British culture. Closing out, even here, much more attention has been paid to the covert U.S. role than the British. As for the rest of history, there is virtually complete silence, similar to the darkness that prevails over other episodes in Britain's recent foreign policy, where less than the noblest intentions were in evidence. The British public is not in a good position to understand the roots of current terrorism, and that government institutions posing as our protectors are really those who have endangered us. This book results from the several months' research at the National Archives in London, where I looked at the British declassified files on policy towards countries in the Islamic world. The research for a subject as large as this can perhaps never be exhaustive, and there are also many unknowns in British foreign policy in some of the episodes considered here. I invite others to complete the picture in those areas. All right, so that ends the first part that I wanted to cover. Here's the second part. This is where Curtis describes the birth of the Saudi alliance. You'll find this is also in line with John Loftus's work on this, including the 10-minute clip that I included in the last Smart Reads. The birth of the Saudi alliance. Let's get that squared up. Following the Arab revolt and Britain's defeat of the Turkish armies throughout the region, Hussein proclaimed himself king of all the Arab countries, including the Hijaz. But the British government was prepared to recognize only his control of the latter. Confrontation over the future of Arabia ensued between Hussein and another British protege, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, an emir and rising power in Central Arabia whose forces had captured the Najd region with its capital at Riyadh. British officials had been split on who to champion as the leader of the revolt against the Turks. The British government of India had feared British sponsorship of an Arab caliph who would lead the entire Muslim world, and the effects this might have on Muslims in India, and therefore favored Ibn Saud, whose pretensions were limited to Arabia. In contrast to Hussein's orthodox Sunnism, the future founder of Saudi Arabia sat at the head of an ultra-conservative Sunni revivalist movement now known as Wahhabism, which professed a strict adherence to the tenets of Islam and which had developed in the 18th century based on the teaching of the theologian Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, born in 1703. Ibn Saud's military forces were the Ikhwan, or Brotherhood, a militia of Bedouin tribesmen instructed by the religious teachers who were committed to the purification of Islam and the advancement of government based on strict Islamic law. Britain had already provided arms and money to Ibn Saud during the First World War, signing a treaty with him in 1915 and recognizing him as the ruler of the Najd province under British protection. By the end of the war, he was receiving a British subsidy of £5,000 a month, considerably less than the £12,000 doled out to Hussein, whom the British government at first continued to favor. That some British officials were pinning their strategic hopes on Ibn Saud during the war is evidenced in a memorandum from one British soldier, a Captain Bray, on the Mohammedan question in 1917. I'm not going to read the whole quote. In 1919, that's around the time of the end of the First World War, London used aircraft in Hijaz in support of Hussein's confrontation with Ibn Saud. It was to little avail. After accepting a temporary ceasefire in 1920, Ibn Saud's 150,000-strong Ikhwan, that's his army, advanced relentlessly, and by the mid-1920s had gained control of Arabia, including the Hijaz and the Holy Places, defeating Hussein for supremacy in the region. Ibn Saud established Saudi Arabia in an orgy of murder. In his expose of the corruption of the Saudi ruling family, Said Abu-Rish describes Ibn Saud as a, quote, lecher and a bloodthirsty autocrat whose savagery wreaked havoc across Arabia, end quote, terrorizing and mercilessly slaughtering his enemies. The conquest of Arabia cost the lives of around 400,000 people, since Saud's forces did not take prisoners. Over 1 million people fled to neighboring countries. Numerous rebellions against the House of Saud subsequently took place, each put down in, quote, mass killings of mostly innocent victims, including women and children, end quote. By the mid-1920s, most of Arabia had been subdued. 40,000 people had been publicly executed, and some 350,000 had had limbs amputated. The territory was divided into districts under the control of Saud's red relatives, a situation which largely prevails today. The British recognized Ibn Saud's control of Arabia by 1922, his subsidy, his funds from the British government, was raised to £100,000 a year by Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. So Churchill is grooming the controllers of Saudi Arabia so that Britain can control the resources of Saudi Arabia and use it as a proxy for their plans. At the same time, Churchill described Ibn Saud's Wahhabis as akin to the present-day Taliban, telling the House of Commons in July 1921 that they were, quote, austere, intolerant, well-armed, and bloodthirsty, end quote, and that, quote, they hold it as an article of duty as well as faith to kill all who do not share their opinions and make slaves of their wives and children. Women have been put to death in Wahhabi villages for simply appearing in the streets. It is a penal offense to wear a silk garment. Men have been killed for smoking a cigarette. End quote. Another footnote. However, Churchill also later wrote that, quote, my admiration for him, Ibn Saud, was deep because of his unfailing loyalty to us. End quote. And the British government set about consolidating its grip on his loyalty. In 1917, London had dispatched Harry St. John Philby, or St. John Philby, father of Kim, the later Soviet spy, to Saudi Arabia, where he remained until Ibn Saud's death in 1953. This is one of those books, Philby of Arabia. You can learn about MI6 agent, secret agent St. John Philby. Another time. Philby's role was to, quote, consult with the Foreign Office over ways to consolidate the rule and extend the influence of Ibn Saud. A 1927 treaty ceded control of the country's foreign affairs to Britain. When elements of the Ikhwan opposed to the British presence in the country rebelled against the regime in 1929, Ibn Saud called for British support. The RAF, Royal Air Force, and troops from the British-controlled army in neighboring Iraq were dispatched, and the rebellion was put down in the following year. Ibn Saud highly appreciated Britain's support for him, especially during the rebellion, and this paved the way for the development of relations between the Saudi kingdom and the West that became the core of Saudi foreign policy. Let's see. Officially proclaimed in 1932 and to a large extent a British creation, Saudi Arabia would go on to act as the world's main propagator of fundamentalist Islam, providing the ideological and financial center of global jihadism. Indeed, Saudi Wahhabism has been described as, quote, the founding ideology of the modern jihad. So the British set up Saudi Arabia and started grooming people that today are known to be terrorists in many parts of the world, including the United States. Palestine and the Mufti. Britain's promotion of the leader of the Sunnis in Iraq was soon echoed in Palestine at the same time. The background was that Britain's new mandate over Palestine was seen as crucial to its interests in the region, providing a foothold in the eastern Mediterranean, a buffer between the Suez Canal and possible enemies to the north, and opening up a clear overland route to the huge oil reserves of British-controlled Iraq. White House stated policy in Palestine was to carry out the Balfour Declaration and create a home for the Jewish people, but, quote, without prejudice, end quote, to the Arab inhabitants. Much has been written about the British objectives in making the declaration. Proclaimed some weeks before Britain captured Palestine from the Turks in December 1917, so they hadn't captured the area, but they had made a plan to give it away, Prime Minister David Lloyd George said that the declaration was designed to secure the support of the Jews in the First World War. The historian, Barbara Tuchman, remarks that the declaration, quote, allowed Britain to acquire the Holy Land with a good conscience, end quote. British planners were set on seizing Palestine away, quote, but they had to have a good moral case, end quote, and the declaration was issued, quote, to dignify that approaching moment, end quote. Britain also saw the Jewish national home as creating a reliable client population in a strategically important region, and to keep the French, the controllers of neighboring Syria, out of a territory bordering on the Suez Canal and close to the Arabian Peninsula. British rule in Palestine lasted for 30 years until the military withdrawal in 1948, also tying back to last Smart Reads. It was continually confronted with the competing claims of the majority of Arab population, which feared displacement by increasing Jewish immigration, and the Jewish population, whose Zionist vision was the consolidation of a homeland as promised by the British. London's policy under the Mandate came to be condemned by Jews and Arabs alike. To a large extent, that policy was set by officers of the military and colonial administration on the ground, some of whom favored the Arabs, some of whom the Jews. There were those like General Sir Wallace Congreve, a senior British military commander, who said that, quote, "I dislike them all equally, Arabs and Jews and Christians. In Syria and Palestine, they're all alike, a beastly people. The whole lot of them is not worth a single Englishman," end quote. Overall, however, British strategy in Palestine clearly favored the Jewish population throughout the 1920s and 30s in its sponsorship of immigration into Palestine. This changed the demographic balance in Palestine from 600,000 Arabs and 80,000 Jews in 1917 to 1 million Arabs and 400,000 Jews by 1938. The basic policy was set by the 1922 White Paper, drawn up by Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill. He drew up the papers to do all the stuff that's been going on and has a war in the Middle East still today. He and his friends, whose concern was to ensure that no Arab majority could stand in the way of Jewish immigration. Churchill, a lifelong Zionist, with a footnote, regularly spoke against the possibility of the Arabs in Palestine achieving self-determination and representative government. He also regarded the Arabs as, quote, a lower manifestation, end quote, than the Jews, who, he contended, accomplished much more economically in Palestine and were, quote, a higher grade race, end quote, compared to, quote, great hordes of Islam, end quote, who were unable to cultivate the land. Within this basically pro-Jewish context, however, the British also worked to build up Arab religious forces in order to maintain British control in the territory. So as they're doing deals with the Zionists, they're also building up other proxy armies to keep the conflict going. In his analysis of Palestine under British mandate, Tom Segev argues that al-Husseini was a, quote, vocal advocate of terror against Zionism, end quote, and that his appointment as Mufti by the British did not soften his view, although he turned in public to more legitimate political means to further the Arab cause. So the British are even placing leaders in there who are making trouble. This doesn't apply to all British people. This talks more about the people who design British foreign policy. Just for that clarification. Got a lot of friends in Britain. Let's skip that. Let's cover this section. Now that we have an idea of the handiwork and the craftsmanship and the reasons that the British Empire was grooming Muslim Brotherhood, propping up the Saudi regime, continuing to divide and conquer, not just in Palestine, but in India and a whole bunch of other countries, and used World War I's peace conference as the place where they could redraw those maps and start instilling their mandates and carrying out their rule throughout the empire, which at that time was pretty much global. Here we are on page 141. This is a section called British Covert Action. The British role in the Afghan War, this is talking about the one in the 70s and 80s. The British role in the Afghan War mainly involved covert military training and arms and supplies, but also extended beyond Afghanistan into the Muslim republics of the southern Soviet Union. Britain played a vital role in support of the United States and acted as a de facto covert arm of the United States government, its role often went beyond what United States forces, faced with far greater congressional oversight than existed in Britain, were able or willing to undertake. I kind of disagree with how that's framed up in the paragraph. It seems like the people with less oversight and greater freedom would be leading and using the U.S. in that circumstance and not the other way around. However, I contend that it's a very well constructed paragraph, and it's pretty close to what's going on. Thus, British covert forces, unlike those of the U.S., played a direct role in the war, undertaking scouting and backup roles with the resistance groups that they and their colleagues were training. Indeed, during the early stages of the war, British SAS commandos were going in and out of Afghanistan and from Pakistan, moving supplies to the Afghan groups independently of the Pakistanis and contrary to General Zia's demands. Britain initially proposed to the U.S. to ship Soviet-made arms to the Afghan forces in order to disguise their origin. President Carter agreed to this operation, apparently unaware that the arms were to be supplied through a network of Mansour al-Khazar, a British agent who was also supplying Pakistani radicals, noted in Chapter 6. It was at the request of the United States that, from spring 1986, Britain shipped 600 blowpipe, shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, mothballed following their ineffectual role in the Falklands War, to the Afghan troops. MI6 also helped the CIA early in the war by activating long-established British networks of contacts in the country, a similar role, in fact, to that played by MI6 in the 1953 coup of Iran, where the CIA and MI6 overthrew democratically elected Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah, which led to the 1979 hostage-taking, which we'll get in a minute because it's all tied together. Thus, Britain could come in very handy, although, as one British intelligence expert noted, the Americans paid most of the bills. By now, the specialist British role in covert action depended on American largesse. The SAS worked alongside U.S. Special Forces in training Pakistan's Special Services Group, SSG, whose commandos guided guerrilla operations in Afghanistan. So out of this, you've got the British and Americans funding, training, arming mujahideen, freedom fighters that have an Arab nationalist bent that comes from World War II. This has been going on a long time. What's been cooking that comes up to 9/11. 80 years. It was stewing on the stove, being funded by taxpayer dollars, being hidden by national security, being done without oversight, and being used conveniently to scare people in these countries to giving up their rights. Now he brings in Osama bin Laden. He claims that neither Pakistan nor the United States realized that Osama bin Laden, quote, might later do with the organization that they had assembled for him, enabled him to establish, right? So they give this guy this network, arms, they get him all pissed off, and then they're like surprised that he would come back and orchestrate 9/11. Again, according to the official story, even if you go with the official story, the guy who's the mastermind of it is an agent of MI6 and works closely with CIA. The CIA provided a variety of arms to the ISI. That's the Pakistani intelligence arm that was created by the British that actually paid Mohammed Atta $100,000. So this is going back to the evidence. When you follow the evidence, it goes back not to a conspiracy theory, but to facts about US and UK foreign policy. The CIA provided a variety of arms to the ISI, including plastic explosives, sniper rifles, and sophisticated electronic timing and detonation devices that made it easier to set off explosions from a remote location. Dual-use items that could be used both for attacking military targets and also in terrorist operations. You'd think they wouldn't want to do that, but when you understand that they profit from it, it makes a lot of sense. Brigadier Mohammed Yusuf of the ISI later noted that training ranged from striking a knife between the shoulder blades of a Soviet soldier shopping in a bazaar to, quote, the placing of a briefcase bomb in a senior official's office, end quote. So they're teaching them how to conduct terrorist operations with taxpayer dollars from both countries. Let me just go back to the end of this chapter and pick up the end. Bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization was a direct product of the war, the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Set up in 1988 out of the networks that were developing between the Afghans and the foreign fighters. Tony Blair's foreign secretary, Robin Cook, who would later say that the name al-Qaeda, meaning the base, derived from the database. Quote, the computer file of the thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with help from the CIA, end quote. And he forgot to say MI6. Several of the Afghan camp networks built at this time with CIA, ISI, or Saudi aid would subsequently be used by al-Qaeda as bases for training and planning terrorist attacks, including Tora Bora, south of Jalalabad, which was constructed by one of Yunus Khalis' commanders. Al-Qaeda would likely not have emerged to the extent that it did had it not been for the infrastructure of the Afghan resistance built with U.S. and British backing. Specific British contributions included specialized military training provided to various forces, covert military supplies, and support for the larger U.S. covert role in the war. Whitehall thus made a British contribution to the imminent emergence of global Islamist terrorism. However, it would be the emergence of new Pakistani forces from the Afghan jihad that would be just as important to the future of global terrorism as the creation of al-Qaeda, and these would eventually prove more dangerous to Britain. As we get near page 200, this is page 178, talks about the account of the Advice and Reformation Committee, Bin Laden's front organization in London, received funds from banks in Sudan, Dubai, and the United Arab Emirates. From London, the money was transferred to al-Qaeda cells in western cities and to several Islamic centers and charities in locations including Bosnia, Kosovo, and Albania. Bin Laden's London base. While backing the Saudi royals, however, Britain also provided a hospitable base for those who had by now become their nemesis. In July 1994, Osama bin Laden established an office in London called the Advice and Reformation Committee, which sought to promote worldwide opposition to the Saudi regime, in immediate response to the Saudis revoking his citizenship, according to a declassified CIA report. Run from a house in Wembley, North London, the ARC was equipped with a bank of fax machines and computers, which churned out dozens of pamphlets and communiques lambasting the lavishness of the House of Saud and its waywardness from promoting Sharia law in the country, and was calling for a breakup of the Saudi state. Now let's just pause there for a second. That's a lot to take in. So the British are setting up the Saudis and using the Islamist movements as proxy fighters. And then at the same time, they're working with bin Laden. And at the same time, bin Laden's talking smack against the Saudis, but it's all being run from London. So that's pretty interesting. That's a complex political dynamic to be able to internalize. So you might have to think about that. But just internalizing that part's important because that's how it works in history. It is not as we are told on TV, on the news. According to recent U.S. court documents, the ARC was, quote, designed both to publicize bin Laden's statements and to provide cover for activity in support for al-Qaeda's military activities, including the recruitment of trainees, the disbursements of funds, and the procurement of equipment and services, end quote. In addition, the London office served as a communications center for reports on the military, security, and other matters from various al-Qaeda cells to its leadership, end quote. A U.S. Congressional Research Service report released just after the September 11 attacks in 2001 noted that bin Laden even visited London in 1994 and stayed for a few months in Wembley to form the ARC. Other sources claim that he visited London in 1994 to meet members of the Algerian armed Islamic group, and even that he traveled regularly to London in 1995 and 96 on his private jet. Whatever the truth of these claims, bin Laden's telephone billing records from 1996 to 1998 show that nearly a fifth of his calls, 238 out of 1,100, the largest single number, were made to London, showing the importance of this base. It was the ARC that arranged a meeting between bin Laden and a number of CNN journalists in March 1997. So I could go on reading that, but I think that's enough to get you interested to check out the book from that capacity. There's a lot there. There's a lot more. I don't want to do any spoilers, but he's got a headquarters in London. He's fully supported. It was known what was going on, what he was doing. And let's go on more. The 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings were not the only terrorist outrages being planned by bin Laden or those close to him during the period when the ARC was based in London. So he's planning global terrorist attacks out of London as his headquarters. In 1996, a secret CIA analysis showed that the U.S. was aware of bin Laden's financing of Islamic extremists responsible for attempted bombings against 100 U.S. servicemen in Aden, the Gulf of Aden, in December 1992. It just goes on to say, Curtis goes on to say that these events continued to be useful to British foreign policies. So the terrorist attacks are useful to plans that exist before the attacks. Is that coincidental, or is that some sort of conspiracy? Those are people getting together, making plans to kill other people ahead of time, sending and logistics and preparing and funding. Look up Machiavelli's work on conspiracy. It's a real political tactic that adults know about. I'm going to jump into the 9/11 connections, page 249. But 9/11 also marked a new period in U.S. and British collusion with radical Islam in sharply different form to that which preceded it. Instead of primarily seeing these forces as allies to achieve foreign policy objectives, as on numerous occasions in the past, London and Washington would now publicly present them as their number one global enemy. But to achieve the same principal goal, control of the key energy-rich regions, notably the Middle East. This new form of collusion did not, however, herald the complete end of the old form. As we shall see, Britain would still collaborate with some radical Islamic forces and those allied to them after 9/11. Britain under Tony Blair happily stood shoulder to shoulder with Washington in implementing this strategy, not only to put it beyond doubt who was the U.S.'s number one ally, parenthetically, in the face of rivals such as Germany and Japan, but also for other reasons of pure self-interest. That terrorism would provide a rationale for a new phase in Britain's own military intervention around the world. Since the government conducted a Strategic Defense Review, SDR, in 1998, British military forces had been quietly reconfigured from an ostensibly defensive role to an overtly offensive one, with a new focus on, quote, expeditionary warfare, end quote, and, quote, power projection, end quote, overseas. In the post-Cold War, this is a quote, in the post-Cold War, we must be prepared to go into the crisis rather than to have the crisis come to us, the SDR noted, outlining a strategy of using, quote, preemptive military force. Which came first, the Strategic Defense Review or strengthening America? What was it? The PNAC document, renewing America's defenses, or what was that document? The Project for a New American Century document that was made from the neocons who took their policy from Likud Party, who took their policy from the British. So Strategic Defense Review and PNAC document, which came first, because they both propose preemptive war, and I don't think those allies are independently coming up with their own answers. I think they were cheating on that test. It also noted the need for a, quote, new generation of military equipment, end quote, including attack helicopters, new aircraft carriers, submarines, and escorts, the Eurofighter multi-role warplane, and the development of a successor to the Tornado bomber. Quote, long-range air attack, end quote, would be important, quote, as an integral part of warfighting as a coercive instrument to support political objectives, end quote, while, quote, all 10 attack submarines will be equipped to fire Tomahawk land attack missiles to increase their utility in force projection operations, end quote. This was all before September 11th. After, terrorism became the supreme rationale for this same interventionary strategy. In a report published 3 months after 9/11, the All-Party Parliamentary Defense Committee repeated the call for a strategy of, quote, preemptive military action, end quote, and stated that, quote, we must be free to deploy significant forces overseas rapidly, end quote, adding, the implications of an open-ended war on terrorism, particularly one that will address the problems of collapsing and failed states, which create the political space for terror and crime networks to operate, suggest that operations in Central Asia, East Africa, perhaps the Indian subcontinent, and elsewhere will become necessary as a part of an integrated political and military strategy to address terrorism and the basis on which it flourishes. End quote. Moreover, in December 2003, 9 months after the invasion of Iraq, the government would produce a new military strategy in a white paper stating that, quote, the threat from international terrorism now requires the capability to deliver a military response globally, end quote. It committed Britain, quote, to extend our ability to project force further afield than the SDR envisioned, end quote, including, in quote, crises occurring across the sub-Saharan African and South Asia, end quote. The paper repeated the need for, quote, expeditionary forces, end quote, and for the new equipment such as cruise missiles and aircraft carriers, also reiterating, quote, the need to confront international terrorism abroad rather than waiting for attacks within the UK, end quote. For Britain, therefore, the war on terror was replacing humanitarian intervention. Supposedly the concept that had guided Blair's bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. That was humanitarian intervention. Remember that phrasing? That's propaganda. That's public relations. That is the using of other words, words other than the truth to describe the situation. What was especially extraordinary about the British and U.S. ability to manufacture this strategy from 9/11 was who London and Washington designated as their allies. In particular, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were hailed as the key collaborators in the war on terror. In reality, the objective case for bombing Saudi Arabia and Pakistan was perhaps as great as bombing Afghanistan. and incomparably greater than the bombing of Baghdad. 9/11 was to a large extent a product of long-standing Saudi and Pakistani sponsorship of radical Islamist groups. Saudi Arabia had, for nearly 3 decades since 1973, bankrolled a range of Islamist groups, including bin Laden, during the whole of which period Riyadh enjoyed the constant favor of London and Washington. So they're in favor with London and Washington, and they're cranking out terrorists against London and Washington. What's wrong with that picture? Pakistan, meanwhile, was the creator of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, which produced the 9/11 attacks, among other atrocities, and had since the late 1970s established an infrastructure of terrorist camps and networks for export to its region and beyond. Even the interim report of the official 9/11 Commission in the United States, published in June 2004, which severely downplays Pakistan's role in international terrorism, still noted that, quote, Pakistan, not Iraq, was a patron of terrorism and had closer ties with Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda leading up to the September 11 attacks, end quote. And that the Taliban, I'm sorry, that's not the end of the quote. They're making that possessive, or is that a typo? And that the Taliban's hosting of bin Laden in Afghanistan before 9/11 was significantly facilitated by Pakistani support. Pakistani President Musharraf's supposed break with the Taliban after 9/11 was enough to satisfy Washington and London that Islamabad was now an ally. The Saudis failed to repudiate any of their past policies. Pakistan's role in 9/11 also raises a British connection. After 9/11, the Times of India reported that Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, the director of the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, and a strong supporter of the Taliban, had ordered the wiring of $100,000 to the leader of the 9/11 terrorist group, Muhammad Atta. Ahmed's contract in sending the funds was said to be Omar Saeed Sheikh, the Briton of Pakistani origin who had developed links to the HUA terrorist group and whom Musharraf later accused of being an MI6 agent. Subsequently, various media reported that the FBI and Western intelligence sources believed that Sheikh had indeed transferred the money to Atta and that the FBI had tracked more than $100,000 from the banks in Pakistan to 2 banks in Florida, where accounts were held by Atta, though it did not mention the ISI. General Ahmed stepped down as ISI chief less than a month after 9/11. Skipping down, Sheikh is reported to have told the then Pakistani Army Corps director in Peshawar and later director of the ISI, General Ehsanul Haq, and that he had learned of plans for the terrorist strikes in the United States on a visit to Afghanistan before 9/11. Furthermore, Sheikh later said he was an ISI agent who had been operating in Lahore since his release from prison in 1999. Well, isn't that interesting? U.S. police and intelligence officials have also said that Sheikh had been a procured asset of the ISI. There are also suspicions that Sheikh had been recruited by the ISI as long ago as 1992 when he was a student in London. In this light, it is barely credible that the ISI did not have foreknowledge of 9/11. Omar Saeed Sheikh is the most intriguing possible British connection to 9/11. After being held for 5 years in an Indian jail for kidnapping 4 British and American tourists on behalf of the HUA in 1994, Sheikh was released in December 1999. The Indian government had agreed to a hostage deal whereby Sheikh and 2 other militants were freed in return for the release of 154 passengers on an Indian Airlines jet hijacked by the HUA. While in jail, Sheikh is reported to have had 9 meetings with a British diplomat, with his lawyer present to check on his, quote, living conditions and general welfare, end quote. Yet British intelligence is also reportedly tried to do a deal with Sheikh. According to the report in the Times, while in jail, Sheikh, quote, was secretly offered an amnesty deal by British officials in 1999 if he would betray his links with Al-Qaeda, end quote. British intelligence officials, quote, knew of his terrorist credentials, but believed he had crucial information about Western recruits to militant Islamic groups, end quote. The Foreign Office statement can be interpreted in one of two ways. Either it showed that the British had done a deal with Sheikh, revealing that Whitehall was prepared to secretly collaborate with a known Islamic terrorist, or if the deal was never done, it illustrates how tolerant the British authorities were toward terrorism, even when the victims were British. It is easy to see how this stance would send a message to other British Islamist radicals that their activities abroad would also be tolerated, even if they were involved in kidnapping and aircraft hijacking. All right, I think there's one last section. Talks about other British agents. They got other British agents going on. Let's see. He's talking about Abu Hamza. The record of the Hamza MI5 meetings show that MI5 and Special Branch were perfectly aware that Britain was, quote, seen as a place to fundraise and propagate Islam, end quote. Hamza's security service contacts reportedly warned him not to be involved in, quote, incitement to commit terrorism and violence overseas, end quote. But they appear to have been going through the motions since no steps were taken at this time to rein him in. So they're talking about how that's the rule, but when he breaks it, nobody does anything, and so he's doing it with the approval. Let's see. Hussein worked for MI5 gathering information on Abu Hamza. He later recalled how, quote, I told them, MI5, Hamza was brainwashing people and sending them to Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps in Afghanistan, that he was preaching jihad and murder, and that he was involved in the provision of false passports. I told them that he was a chief terrorist. However, Hussein's MI5 handler did not appear to be unduly worried. A stream of would-be jihadists continued to visit the mosque to hear Hamza preach, including Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and Muhammad Sadiq Khan, the 7/7 bomber, who went there in 2002. From the late 1990s, Hamza also had begun organizing military training for members of his supporters of Sharia organization at country retreats in Kent and England, Wales, and Scotland, where they were taught how to strip down AK-47s and handguns. The Observer reported that one training session in Wales in 1998, around 10 jihadists were trained by British ex-soldiers, some of whom had fought in Bosnia. Quote, but the British security services were either unconcerned or ignorant about Hamza's activities, end quote, the paper noted. So, it goes into this last section. It says, this was 2 months after 9/11. It was only later that the authorities moved against Hamza. In September 2002, the police launched an investigation into terrorist fundraising linked to the Finsbury Park Mosque and raided it in the following January. So it's like after they set the fire, then the fire department shows up to put out the fire. And that's like a cozy business, setting up fires, putting them out. That's going to conclude my reading from Secret Affairs, Britain's collusion with radical Islam. And at this point, I will open it up for anyone who has questions, observations, these sort of things, because I just laid out a lot of little known facts about stories that people think they know already without asking any questions. The official stories of 7/7, the official story of 9/11, the official story of all those CIA, MI6 overthrow coups around the world for the 40 or 50 years that preceded that, and the proxy forces and that go along with it. When you see the oil crisis in the 1970s, and you know that, oh, it's the United States and Britain that set that up, So it's a way of applying pressure using proxies, a popular tactic of the empire that has now been like fully taken on since the Anglo-American establishment started in 1902 upon the death of Cecil Rhodes. And the first working group for that, besides the Pilgrim Society, was the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which Mark Curtis was a research fellow for. So, all right, let me go back to full screen. How's everybody doing? Thank you guys all for showing up, even though I was a little bit late for the show today. Who's got questions?
I had something, Richard.
How you doing, Ferdinand?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Spilling my tea as I'm trying to answer. I'm outstanding.
Okay, good. I have some tea here as well. So early on in the presentation, you had skipped over a paragraph, and I saw something in there that was interesting. I was able to capture it in a screenshot. And if I can pull that up here, it says this was a letter from one British soldier, a Captain Bray, on the Mohammedan question in 1917. And the paragraph says, at the present moment, agitation is intense in all the Mohammedan countries. The reports of agents and others confirm the extreme vitality of the movement, pan-Islam. I'm inferring that your finger's covering the word Islam, but it can only mean that. It is essential that the country to whom Mohammedans look should not be Afghanistan. We should therefore create a state more convenient for ourselves, to whom the attention of Islam should be turned. We have an opportunity in Arabia. So when I saw that, what struck out was the word Afghanistan in there, and I thought, well, why not Afghanistan? Was there some pan-Islamic leader there, and if so, who? Right? So I looked at Wikipedia, we'll look up pan-Islam, and they give a real pencil, a very brief sketch of it. And they say in the modern era, a gentleman by the name of Al-Afghani was a leader of the movement, right? And then it immediately skips to the post-colonial world, and pan-Islamism somehow becomes Islamism, and they talk about Sayyid Qutb, Ayatollah Khomeini, etc., right? Real radicals. So I look up about this Al-Afghani gentleman. See what I got here. We're so spoiled with computers everywhere. So I won't read the whole thing. So anyway, this guy died 20 years before that letter was written, right? So he could not have been the leader in Afghanistan that this British soldier is writing about. However, I think his ideas, which I'll share here, are, if there were leaders in Afghanistan at that time that the British didn't want and they preferred the Saudis, So according to another source, Al-Afghani was greatly disappointed by the failure of the Indian Mutiny and came to three principal conclusions from it. One, European imperialism, having conquered India, now threatened the Middle East. Two, that Asia, including the Middle East, could prevent the onslaught of Western powers only by immediately adopting the modern technology like the West. Three, that Islam, despite its traditionalism, was an effective creed for mobilizing the public against the imperialists. Al-Afghani held that Hindus and Muslims should work together to overthrow British rule in India. A review rehashed by, I don't know, some guy 5 decades later. So that kind of skips over it. But anyway, so this is a guy preaching an anti-imperialist creed in Afghanistan. He ended up dying in Constantinople 20 years before that letter was written. And against, British rule in India, against, European influence in the Middle East. So, of course, they're going to pick, and he was interested in uniting Muslims as opposed to being very extremist. I'm not saying the guy was an angel. I don't know much about him, but he sounds certainly more reasonable from what a little I've read than the regime in Riyadh.
Well,
So,
and there's a
no
lot.
surprise that with their record of divide and rule that they would go with that solution for their projects.
Right. So British conquest over India goes way back, like probably into the 1600s when they discovered opium. When the English discovered that there was opium on the other side of the world, and Queen Elizabeth starts sending out ships to go get some of that, keep bringing it back, and then
Right.
starts the East India Company. So you've got subjugation of the Indian subcontinent from early on, and Pakistan, Afghanistan. Pakistan doesn't exist. That's just the section later partitioned off by the British, and that's supposed to be a Muslim country as opposed to India being a Hindu country, right? So that's an artificial creation, which is why they've been fighting since then,
Yeah.
right? And then you've got Afghanistan. I'm not sure who is al-Afghani's predecessor, his dad, maybe, as a tribal
Right.
warlord type character.
I don't
The
know.
British had, like I said, 3 Anglo-Afghan wars trying to take over that area in the 1800s and early 1900s. And that
Right.
was a no-go. They couldn't do it on their own. So when the Soviets later tried to take it and the British are helping the Americans to push it out, that's like Anglo-Afghan War 4. And now we're in Anglo-Afghan War 5 that's been going on for 18 years. When you look at it like that, it makes a lot more sense. It's not just post 9/11 these things happen. The goals were there before 9/11, and people like bin Laden custom tailored to be the character in that situation. Now you could take al-Afghani's his credo or his rules of engagement with the British Empire, and he's long gone. You apply it to your MI6 cutout character, Osama bin Laden, who's been groomed in Saudi Arabia by these clerics that you put there to train those people anyway, right? So then they apply that rhetoric to him. He's out there making these moves, but wholly supported, and it's not like he's the black sheep of that multi-billion-dollar Saudi family. That's his role. That's his role in the game that these guys have set up. They call it the Great Game, the British. And they used to play it against like their cousins and stuff in the other countries in Europe. But after World War I, when that didn't exist, America, hey, cousin America, get over here. We're playing the Great Game. And the new Great Game is going on, and 9/11 is part of it. So it's a game of grabbing resources, grabbing territory, subjugating people, making sure that legitimate freedom doesn't spring up anywhere else, because it'd be a challenge to the arms dealers and the oligarchs who control the present day global war on terror and thrive on it.
Sure. And don't forget the opium.
And don't forget the opium. All right. So by like the 1700s, not all, but a substantial portion of gold and silver from Europe is now in the hands of China, because China would only take gold and silver for the opium, or is that how that was, or for the silks. So, and the other trade goods, the Chinese wouldn't trade for European goods. They saw them as subpar. So all the money goes over there. And then the British and the other countries are trying to figure out how to get that money back. So the British go, so it starts with slaves in America. American cotton goes across the ocean to Manchester in these textile mills that make fabric. The fabric is taken to India, where people can't weave that type of fabric, so they're willing to trade things for it. What do they have to trade? They have these giant warehouses of big balls of opium, just like stacks as far as you can see. Look at the drawings from back in the day. It's pretty interesting warehouse system they had set up, and they take that opium over and they subjugated the Chinese, got them hooked on opium, such that there were 2 opium wars against the British. That was the Chinese emperor trying to kick the British out. All at the same time, we are dumping the tea over on the other side of the world, same British East India Company. So the fur trade from America and Canada in the early days was those furs were being taken to Europe, yes, but they're also being taken to China, and they're being traded for opium. And the evidence of that would be, you could see the ship manifests of John Jacob Astor and other famous fur traders bringing back tens and tens and tens of tons of opium to America, and also taking it to Europe because they could sell it for more over there. So there's a lot to it, and you can't understand 9/11, if you don't know about the East India Company, the drug history that created MI6 and these other mechanisms that funded the proxy armies that came, that, got covered up. I mean, that's at the official story level. If you look higher, they just need that proxy group, the Islamists, the Islamist rebels, the terrorists, because they already had it all planned out. But they can't just do it themselves because that's just too overt. So they use proxy groups to do that. And then they pin it on those proxy groups as patsies. So it starts with foreign policy objectives in like dimly lit offices where people were writing up their plans. And then those get attached to money, and then they get attached to proxy forces. Those proxy forces gets trained, armed, pointed at targets, and then they get picked up afterwards. That's been going on for a long time, and without people understanding that angle, it's going to continue to go on into the future and get much, much worse because the technology that they're developing today can take away freedom of individuals a lot faster. Thank you, Ferdinand.
Thank you. Interesting book. I'll have to pick it up.
Yeah, it is an interesting book for sure. Especially once you start to understand the context of where it fits into the overall Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament, Royal Institute of International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, and their plan for global domination through the arms trade, through covert activities, through national security, through a bunch of means that the people would never approve of. And thus, those plans of real action that take place in the real world, they have to be hidden away from the public. I don't know what name you'd want to give that, but it's not truth, it's not freedom, it's not facts, and it's not history. Anyone else with questions, comments, complaints about today's book or my reading of it?
Hey, Richard, this is Michael.
How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing well. Really appreciate this book as well. I mean, this is some good stuff. I'm interested, currently there's some stuff going on in the Middle East. Musharraf, the leader of Pakistan at the time of 9/11, has essentially been, sentenced to execution at this point. And then the Saudi government is under a great deal of pressure, essentially by people within the government and within the country, to the point that the U.S. military is kind of stationed outside of its palaces and so forth. And I think in general, it seems like the Middle East, the American influence, the U.S. influence, is deteriorating rather quickly. And I'm wondering, with this game going on, the Chinese influence in the area growing. It's almost like it appears that there's another game being played in which the U.S. influence in the world is decreasing, and the Chinese influence in the world is increasing. And
that's
it's going
absolutely
along
true.
These same lines.
That's exactly what's going on. The United States is supposed to be turned into a fourth world country. You take away productivity, any type of industrialization, you pass a bunch of laws that make it hard for people to start any type of manufacturing business to bring jobs back to this country. And then at the same time, you got a country of 1 billion people who was groomed and sponsored by British Empire interests over 200 years. So by the time the communists get installed and Mao and these characters get in there and kill 25, 50 million people, and then after that, you've got a group that have been born into a world where they don't know anything other than tyranny, slavery, not freedom. And then on top of that, they're like, hey, we have slave labor. Let's undercut the West's ability to provide products, and let's just undercut it all because they have slave labor. So then everybody's purchasing products from over there, becoming totally dependent. And then they can raise their prices and you can't do anything about it because you don't have any industrialization. And then they can just buy out everybody's everything because you've got a big economic imbalance. That's part of the plan. The British Empire could not take on America and American freedom directly. It tried twice. It then tried to undermine education to get to undermining foreign policy. It successfully did that. In the 20th century, it married American values up with British imperialism and conquest around the world. We took over the bases in 1945, Bases for Destroyers Act where we gave Britain a bunch of destroyers for the war, and they gave us bases around the world, gave us bases. There is no separation between American and British intelligence. They were bonded early on. The MI6, Ian Fleming worked with Wild Bill Donovan to draw up blueprints for OSS and later CIA. These are the things we have in our country are not sovereign to America. They are not defending American freedom. They are not protecting American individuals' interests. They are part and parcel of a bureaucracy created specifically for the reunionization, bringing back America into the British Empire, an empire which still exists even under the name Commonwealth. Because if you look at the former British territories that all now have votes in the United Nations, there's a lot of those. And they all still have that little Union Jack in their flag. So there's more going on to the story of our reality than most people have awareness of. And some of the people who aren't aware are actually interested, though many who are not aware would never be interested. They take no responsibility in their freedom, and thus they are content in their slavery.
It's also interesting, the defense industry's kind of hands in this as well, because just like the British, like you kind of alluded to with the House of Saud, and then Osama bin Laden kind of being opposition to him, but being supported by the British as well, is they're selling, military goods to both sides. They're selling them to the Saudis and they're selling them to the terrorists that are against the Sauds. There's that element where, the British or the defense industries, which are, multinational as well, are essentially exacerbating both sides of the conflict or potential conflict, so that they can sell weapons to both sides. But I'm wondering, with Israeli Mossad, they're actually involving themselves in places like this. They have throughout Africa as well as the Middle East, but now they're actually involving themselves in places like Honduras and Central America. And I'm wondering if that's not the same game plan there, where they're creating opposition forces where they can sell more weapons to, governments that are under duress.
Well, I'd also say that there's pretty much there's no defining line anymore between MI6, American intelligence assets, or Israeli intelligence operations. They are part and parcel of the same plan of action that was created by the Anglophiles and then bought into through the Balfour Declaration. And so it's like a tripartite type of power structure. And that power structure seems pretty coherent and self-defensive, as far as Americans and British supporting Israeli policy, Israel and America supporting British policy, and Britain and Israel supporting American policy in the key facets that fit into the overarching plan and not the day-to-day minutia of what's going on in the clown circus out there that you call politics or see on mainstream news, because that has nothing to do with reality. The only thing that has to do with reality in those places are the cameras, the actors, the studio, the microphones, the lights, the graphics. Those are all real things. The things they're talking about are not real things most of the time when they're talking about these geopolitical events, because the people there don't have the wherewithal to understand what's going on, and they can only read scripts given to them by the White House or Whitehall or one of these places. So authorities trickling down and people who parrot things reading them.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, like with the downfall or the kind of the diminishing of the U.S. influence, if the British aren't using the Israeli Mossad to essentially create that kind of turmoil in, what is, generally, the United States backyard, the Central and South America, where they're, really kind of fomenting a situation in which, American influence is being diminished even in their backyard by other forces, so to appear like with what will be the media for the next, I don't know, 10 or 20 years is, this problem with the Central American and South American countries where, America used to have like total influence.
Well, I think there's the dynamic that's going on these days is that Mossad is really, really good at intel collection, right? I don't know if it's exactly Mossad. They might have a sub-agency like NSA, CIA, right? But collecting information and human intelligence, excellent. So if you're going to be grooming proxy forces like Al-Qaeda and what's the more recent incarnations of that? They've got a whole bunch of ISIS. They got a whole bunch of names they give it these days, right? If you're going to be grooming those proxies, would you use people from America or people from Britain, or would you maybe use indigenous people that could be Mossad agents? And those are the handlers on the ground because they have the human intelligence grasp, whereas somebody coming from America is completely foreign to Middle Eastern traditions, ways, languages, customs, these sort of things, right? So it seems like the countries that participate bring their strengths and they complement each other by covering their weaknesses. And that's how they've conducted political warfare through the 20th century, or at least the last 60, 70 years. Any other questions, comments, observations, things you put together from hearing these quotes illustrated for you or narrated?
Hi, Rich.
How you doing? Hi, Pam.
I wanted to ask, what was the author of this book? Could you tell me what his connection again? I thought you said something like he was in a think tank or something like that, and I'm not too sure Wikipedia would talk about that.
That's right. So his name's Mark Curtis, and he's a British journalist, and he was formerly a fellow researcher at the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
Okay, thanks.
Which was the parent company, basically, of America's Council on Foreign Relations.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for being a reader, Pam. Anyone else with last words for this episode, at least?
Rich, just the other thing on you had the Strategic Defense and Review from the British in, I think, 1998. And the PNAC group was formed in 97, but
Rebuilding Our Defenses. On the cover, I remember I have it printed out somewhere in the library here. On the cover of the Rebuilding America's Defenses, the RAD document. So SDR was the British version, RAD is the American version. PNAC 1997, but I thought they wrote the paper in 98, or is it the CFR?
I think
journal?
I think it's 99 or 2000 actually.
It could be. It could be.
PNAC,
it could be 2000. It was pre 9/11 definitely. So the 98 version that comes out with the SDR is the Council on Foreign Relations Foreign Affairs issue from November 1998. In there's two articles, and I'll do them in a future episode, but I can show you real quick here. It is Bernard Lewis. And then he talks about Osama bin Laden, public enemy number one. And then the other article is Catastrophic Terrorism. And it's by John Deutsch from the CIA, Philip Zelikow of the 9/11 Commission report a couple years later, and Ashton Carter, who was recently, after 9/11, a Secretary of Defense. So three guys come up with this idea, and it is carried forward and articulated into reality by Al-Qaeda, which I thought that's interesting. But even more interesting was the guy, one of the co-authors, getting to be on the 9/11 Commission and run as executive director for the report. So let me grab that. It's right here. Let me just unplug. Play your theme music, the elevator music, if you got it. All right, so that excursion didn't work out. I got like 100 of those issues over here. I thought I knew exactly where it was, and it's not there. It's not in there. So I must have read it someplace else and put it on another shelf. So anyway, I can make that part of the schedule for Smart Reads going forward, because those two articles introduce Osama bin Laden, plus this idea in a different article in the same issue, catastrophic terrorism, specifically noting like the World Trade Center and these types of instances. So there's a whole bunch of points that happen on 9/11 that are mentioned in those two articles, written by a group who has plans to make those types of events happen in history on a semi-regular basis. So very interesting. Apologize for not knowing where that book is, but there's a lot of content to keep track of when you're digging into serious history and not just trying to, take the whipped cream and fluff that's purveyed by mainstream media to make your decisions in life, right? And with that, I'm going to bring it to an end. This is Smart Reads for Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam by Mark Curtis. And in there, we learned how the group known as MI6, British intelligence, is working with the CIA over time, many decades, to groom Islamic proxy forces for use in maintaining control over other areas and populations of the world. And that many of those incarnations and mechanizations that were put into play over time came to a head on 9/11, in that the story behind the events is a lot deeper and involves a lot more substantial content than has ever been purveyed to most anyone who would claim to have knowledge of those events. So until next time, we'll be doing History Connected in the studio next door for next episode. And until then, thank you for tuning in, for not dropping out, and for reading books. Reading is fundamental.